As we head towards NFL Week 7, it truly is a decision point time for your Dynasty rosters. There may be some people out there who have already known for a couple of weeks that the team is, going to have to look to next year. Not necessarily that it's rebuilding, but things have not worked out. You need to maybe freshen some things up, move some veteran players, have your team ready for the start of the 2024 season, get a kickstart on that. It might be a case that your team is 3-3 at this particular point. You may have a losing record. You may have a winning record. Not all records, not all teams are created the same. We're going to talk today a little bit about what you should potentially do to make those decisions and to be able to set yourself up for success. Because winning this year is the goal, but if you can't win this year, Shawn, winning next year is the next best thing. So sometimes it's tough to split those hairs and make those decisions. So that's what we are talking about today, a little bit of big picture strategy from a Dynasty point of view. Where will we start, Shawn? What is the first thing to look at? Is it a case of looking as simple as seeing how many points your roster has put up? Is this team way behind the rest of the league so far? I know it's not going to be as simple as that. We're going to have to check in and see what the roster looks like as well. But realistically, I think if teams at this particular point are 1-5, for example, where's the cutoff point? Is 2-4 a time to still be considering heading for that championship, heading for those playoffs?
One of the things with Dynasty is that there's such a huge temptation to throw in the towel and look to play for next year that you want to remember what your format is and how long the season is. I think for me, one of the things I have to really fight against is to remember that the FFPC main event format and Dynasty formats are different. And I think that a lot of people are going to say, well, Shawn, that's one of the most obvious things. If you're having trouble with that, then maybe you need to go back to Fantasy 101. But the 2 additional weeks does make a big difference, right? Because you think about the league ending after week 12 in redraft versus after week 14 in Dynasty. And so in Dynasty, you're just through 6 of the 14 weeks. You have 8 more to go. And one of the things you have to love about formats with victory points is that you have multiple paths to come back. And so if you have a couple points for the victory, and then many formats will have 2 victory points if you finish in the top 4, 1 victory point if you finish 5-8, and then 0 victory points, again, based on scoring, if you finish 9 through 12. That means if you can go on a little bit of a run where you're in that top third and you're pulling back 4 victory points a week, you can get there in a hurry. So you want to be very open-eyed and reasonable about the quality of your roster, because it's very easy to be in a case where you have a great starting lineup and a really good bench, and to have had injuries that occur in game, or to have players who have underperformed what they would likely do. Say from a full season perspective with Geno Smith, you have some games that aren't that impressive. You've already got the bye in there. And so if you're in a super flex league where you were counting on him to score for you, then you're not at where you could have very reasonably been and where you'll reasonably be as you go forward. When you have a deep and potentially dominant bench, the bye weeks are a time period where you can pull a lot of points back. And so the quality of that portion of your roster is going to make a big difference for the 2 reasons. Obviously, the one with the buys where you can pull points back, but also if you've had players who are very disappointing, and that happens, right? You're not going to hit on everybody in every single season. If you've had disappointing starters and those guys now actually need to move to the bench, if you had either players who were good, but you just didn't have a starting spot for them, or you have players you drafted this year, like a Quentin Johnston, a Jordan Addison, a Jackson Smith and Jigba, players who were on your bench because you didn't know what you were going to get to this point, but now they're starting to emerge for you a little bit, or do you reasonably think that they could emerge in the following weeks, then the quality of your roster is going to be ever-changing. And that evolution matters to you because it gives you a very different sense of what's going to happen over this middle third of the season. And if you're off to a bad start, but your roster is very strong for the middle third, then you wouldn't give up yet, because in a dynasty situation, you can always look to the future, or you can make sure you get into that area we talk about, which is the permanent championship window. Well, permanent championship window means that you're actually making the playoffs every year. You're getting a high percentage of buys, but when you don't, you're still in the playoffs, and then you can have that hot team that wins. Colm, I'm sure that many of our listeners are exactly in the same situation that we're in, where we have all of those sob stories about how, I had the greatest all-time team and I was beaten in the finals. But the thing that balances
that, you got bounced in the semis in your first game after a bye.
Yeah, that part is always the worst. But to balance that out, you have those stories where you were the 6th seed and you didn't deserve to win. Yeah. You didn't deserve to win, but you got hot at the right moment. And maybe you even hammered the number 1 seed in the finals that had a much better team than you had. If you give up right now, then you have gotten rid of that scenario. And in many cases, you won't even move that much in the positioning, because again, if you've perpetually reloaded, your roster is going to be too good to completely tank in environments where there's no consolation. And so one of the things for me that I get kind of pulled in on with the FFPC is that if you can miss the playoffs with an awesome team, then your chances of winning the backdraw are pretty good. Now, you don't want to be overconfident in the backdraw any more than you want to be overconfident in the regular draw, right? But in the regular draw, you're actually facing good teams. So that does make it a little bit trickier. If you miss the playoffs with an elite team in the backdraw, I mean, your chances are pretty good. And when you win the 101, then what it means to you going forward is pretty significant. You've got guys, like a Bijan Robinson, like a Caleb Williams. They're going to either score a lot of points for you, or the trade value is immense. You can completely reshape your team and or take it from a team that is good, but is going to always be in a battle for the 2, 3, 4 seeds, to a team that is going to be the top seed in most years. And in most years, you're very difficult to compete with at all. So that for me is both the fun part and the sort of siren song in leagues where there's a full consolation draw. That part is hard to resist, right? Whereas in the vast majority of leagues where you have maybe the 4th best team, say, and then you have bad injury luck, and suddenly you're the 7th best team. Well, the only way to move up much at all in terms of what your draft slot is going to be you can make some trades, and sometimes that will work. But basically, it's just to tank in a way that is not ethical, right? You're benching some of your better players, and you're trying to get your scores down that way. And still, you're only going to move up a certain percentage. If you can't realistically get to the 101, the 102, the 103 because your team is simply too good, why would you throw in the towel at all when you know that sometimes you're going to win as the 6th seed? There's other little part of it here, Colm, when you talk about those. This is why you never trade your own first-round pick, because you want the flexibility to have a season where you have a lot of injuries, and then you have the 101.
So there's a couple of things. We'll talk about the pick in a second. So on the ethical side, any public service announcement on the ethical side of tanking? Well, there is no real ethical side. The unethical side of it?
Well, it just depends on your league and what the managers have agreed on as appropriate play. But in most of the leagues that I'm in, including the FFPC, if you very clearly start a player with a much lower projection, then that's actually against the rules. Now, it can be difficult to enforce, but if you're doing something that's against the rules, then that's straightforwardly unethical and you shouldn't do.
Yeah, barring injury concerns, like if it's a case that somebody's meant to be playing on a Monday night and that's the only option that you have at that point, and you play somebody over a player, that might make some sense. But yeah, I agree with you. I think it's just something that shouldn't be done. Affects the integrity of the league. And most leagues like the FFPC will have that written into the bylaws, but some leagues that people maybe are playing in, on an individual or home basis may not have that in there. Try not to do that if you can. Try to just play within the rules of the game and the integrity of the game. The other part, Shawn, you mentioned is the pick. So people the first thing they will think of is if they're not making it, they're going to move some players to get picks for next year. But the other part then, if you're trying to potentially do a case of, in the ethical way, move some players on that maybe weakens your current roster, that maybe doesn't help you get wins the rest of the way. But you also mentioned a very good point is if you have moved future picks, and we do get questions in where people are either doing the perpetual reload and acquiring a lot of picks, or else they've built a really stacked roster, but they've also moved their first, second, third round pick, which puts them into the squeeze then that if things do not or have not at this point of the season went the way that they had envisaged in the preseason and the time where they were preparation for the season, it's easy to move a first round pick and be like, well, I'm going to win this league, so it's going to be the 12th pick of the first round, and then all of a sudden your season's not going good, and it looks like it could be the second or third pick of the draft. Why? I guess I've just said why, but what is some of the advice you would give to people on, for next season potentially, if they have moved them this season, why they shouldn't do that in 2024? And for example, in my league over the last 2 weeks, I have traded for DeAndre Swift, and that there was a case where I give up my 2024 first, Shawn, and that one, a team that I really feel is contending, but it also is at this point of the season with a team that is 5-1, for example. You should have a good idea that it's not going to be falling back into the early stages of that draft pick, but it can be one that really backfires on you if the season doesn't go the way that you envision.
Yeah, so you have different incentives based on the calendar. And when you hold your first round pick into the year and you're 5 weeks in, you're 6 weeks in, your opponents can see at least what kind of start that you're off to. And I say what start that you're off to because we don't know that it's going to continue in that direction, but there is a little bit of insulation in Dynasty where when you get off to a good start, you're able to make some trades that bolster your roster. You've got other teams that are simultaneously giving up. And so after you get 5 or 6 weeks in, it does get a little bit trickier to get to the very top or get to the very bottom based on other things that are happening. You still have this big mix in the middle, but once you've demonstrated to your league mates that you're definitively going to be in that top, say 4 range, your first round pick is worth less. And so at that point, you don't necessarily want to trade it unless you get a really good deal back. And sometimes you do. And then you just obviously click accept and you go forward. But you're going to believe in your own ability to outdraft the market. And you think about this most recent season where, we selected a ton of Sam Laporta. Certainly you have someone like Achan who was in that range where that's an early to mid second round pick, right? And so you have a shot to still get big time performers, big time future producers in that range, but it's going to have a lot wider range of outcome than you have with those top couple of picks. In the middle of the offseason, especially if you have a young team, and especially maybe if you're early-ish in the history of the league and you haven't established yourself yet for everyone to see as sort of the dominant force in that league, then if you have a young team and you trade your first-round pick, you can often get a lot back because there are going to be some opposing managers who are projecting you to have a pick in that 101 to 104 range. I was in a situation in the one league where I have traded my first-round pick this year where I won the 101, drafted Bijan, have Jalen Hurts. Even with that, when you put together sort of a punt season to start, you're going to have managers who are still targeting your roster. And that was one where I traded the future first for 3 seconds, a couple of which were early. And so if my first round pick ends up being in that 109 to 112 range, then all 3 of the picks that I got back could be roughly equivalent. And you're looking at those picks and you're saying, okay, well, Sam Laporta, Rashee Rice, Marvin Mims. I mean, I might be willing to trade a first round pick that's, in the 106, 107 range straight up for a Marvin Mims in the offseason. I mean, he's got a ways to go yet to justify that, but even the flashes that we've seen to this point would indicate that if you moved a pick that's a first rounder to get a Marvin Mims, you might be very, very happy with that. Colm, every couple days we get trade offers for Sam Laporta that are 1+, right? And so those picks can quickly become a first rounder. If you had a chance to do that, you would be pulled into it. And so I said, those are all the positives. And yet this is a roster with Jalen Hurts and Bijan Robinson and a good overall starting lineup that did start 1-4. And so certainly the person who traded with me is very excited about where they are, because there's a chance my pick could be very high, not only because, I may miss the playoffs, which is perfect for them, but if my roster is actually good, and again, I approach it ethically, which I would do, I could win them the 101 by winning the backdraw. In that case, I've limited my pathways. And we always talk about trying to create as many paths as possible with Caleb Williams out there, with more guys who are going to emerge. Lots of folks in the Devy community are going to tell you this next draft is fantastic. There are going to be pieces out there where you would really love to have the option of saying, okay, I had some injuries. I had some young players, some rookies who didn't emerge early enough, but they're still going to be part of this elite team. I would have liked to have been able to push it out one more year because I had bad start-sit decisions, because I had bad luck on injuries, because I had guys who simply didn't score enough early enough, even though for a full season. Because one of the things that's going to happen is you're going to have some teams that blow up across weeks 15 through 18. And you look at the full season points and you look back on your roster and you're like, how did I not make the playoffs? I very clearly have the best team now. Well, you're not trying to win week 18. Some of that is going to happen if you have a young roster, because the points are going to be a little backloaded. Some of it is just purely sequencing that you can't control at all. And you had the right roster, but you got bad luck. Sometimes you had the bad luck. We want to create as many pathways as possible without giving up the chance to make a trade like I did. So that would be kind of right on the balance for me, where the scales on both sides, the incentives are similar. And you want to think through what's going to happen. Doesn't mean you're not going to occasionally make some of those moves. But I'm now in a kind of this fun position where, because I moved that pick, I have even more incentive to go win, which sometimes that's kind of what you need. Again, I've mentioned this siren song of getting the 101 next year. You can get the 101 every year and have a lot of fun with the rookie draft. And to an extent, that's what this is all about, right? But when there are also meaningful entry fees, you do want to occasionally win. So I'm actually excited to figure out how to pull this team back. I think it's loaded. And so as other teams realize that their team is too old and not good enough to win now, and as they move into the rebuilding phase, I'm going to move past those guys. I'm going to slingshot them in the middle third of the season. And that's the thing as we head toward week 7 that you want to be very aware of as you're making moves in your league, trying to decide whether to buy, whether to sell. You need to understand the other 11 rosters. You need to know who you're going to jump past and who is going to stay in front of you in all likelihood. Obviously, lots of things that can happen. Injuries will turn your league over multiple times as you go forward, perhaps. But if you can get into that 3, 4, 5 range very reasonably, then you're going to make moves to try and win this year, but also win in the future. And Colm, I think the next point of the conversation would be, if you have a team that is cruising toward the 101 or the 102, what moves are you making, even in that context, to perpetually reload? You and I have a roster that has DeAndre Hopkins. If we are roaring toward the top seed, and right now it's us and another team who look really good for it. Again, not that couldn't change very swiftly, but we have DeAndre Hopkins. Would we look to move him and maybe even move him to that other team if we got the right trade package back? We've got Raheem Mostert. If he scores as many points as we expect over the next 2 or 3 weeks, would we then look to move him? Part of it's always going to be a little bit of a problem if we assume that Achane's coming back, but what are you going to do with a scorer who is putting up points in that kind of vicinity? What are we doing with a Hunter Henry if we get a little bit of a bounce back from him? We have 4 tight ends in Sam Laporta, Evan Ingram, Hunter Henry, Pat Freiermuth. What are we doing to maintain kind of our stranglehold on the tight end position versus making a move that might be mutually beneficial. We got a great note from JJ and his co-manager reaching out to us and just mentioning, we lost Justin Jefferson. We don't know how that's going to work out for almost a full month yet. What moves do we want to make, either selling Justin Jefferson, which I think would be very difficult, and or to bring in pieces to address that hole? Or do we think our roster is strong enough overall? Colm, as you're looking at our team now, where players like a George Pickens, like a Jameson Williams, like a Pat Freiermuth, like a Sam Howell, who has been a very reasonable QB to this point, has had some spike weeks. When those guys are on the bench, do we move them to try and upgrade a starting lineup spot? Or are we thinking our starting lineup is already good enough that those guys are not starters? We're not going to burn any ammunition to more or less just churn the roster that already works just fine.
Yeah, this is a very fascinating part of it, because a lot of people will think if you are contending that you're going to try and buy those pieces to improve your roster immediately. But you mentioned with Hopkins, for example, he's the kind of player that you could see in a lot of leagues, a team that is contending buying from a team that is now heading towards that number one pick. Player who's not going to be really advantageous down the line, but could be the piece that helps you, win a championship this year. The other part of that that's very interesting is, thinking of if you're trying to do that in a situation where you're also contending, the only teams that are really going to want to take on a veteran player like that, who has some season-long value at this particular point, is the teams that you're competing with. So there's that balance of like this year versus down the line, the picks or players that you acquire from them for that piece that may potentially give them a slight edge over you in 2023. But what does that mean beyond that? And does that actually, the player maybe that you can sneak in from the other side of that trade, how does that help you this year? You mentioned some players in there that Hopkins is the very interesting one. He would be for me in a team, if I was thinking of it from a team that isn't contending, the likes of a Hopkins, the likes of a Mostert, those players who are more veteran. The other ones, though, that are in there, we could see some spike weeks potentially from a Jameson Williams, for example. He has had his issues. I know he's still somebody, Shawn, you believe a lot in, but his value is like going to keep moving down that direction. But the players that you mentioned that are on the bench, I think the reason that they are on the bench is just that they haven't got to the point yet where we have been able to add them in with confidence. But with the younger players that you're mentioning about, the later portion of the season, the backloaded points from those guys, they are players that you'll be expecting that to come in as the season goes along. I am really intrigued, though, in the Hopkins one that you mentioned and trying to do that. As a team that's contending, trading to a contending team. Is that something that's not being open about it? That's not something I've done in the past. Is that something that you would feel comfortable doing? What would your concerns be as a contending team trading to another contender in that situation?
If you get something back that is quite valuable, then I'm always looking for the overall quality of the team and to let the playoff randomness do what it does. Understanding that in many of these cases, the power teams already have a high enough replacement player that if you don't make that move, they're actually not going to lose that many points.
Okay.
Whereas when you think about the value to the overall roster in the future, if you have the difference between DeAndre Hopkins or a future first-round pick, that is going to be obviously very significant. So you look at this team that we're competing against for the number one seed, and that's not to say that other teams couldn't jump up over the next couple of weeks. Again, there are 4 victory points at play every week, so you do get some change around there. Maybe we don't continue to go if Justin Jefferson.
That's what I was going to say. Like, based on 2 weeks ago, DeAndre Hopkins is now much more valuable to our team than he was before Justin Jefferson's injury, for example. That's another part to weigh into it.
Because our replacement level is not as high as it was previously. But you look at this team that we're competing with: Cooper Kupp, Adam Thielen, Jacoby Myers, Mike Evans, Tyler Lockett, all of those guys on that roster. Some of those guys scoring a lot of points you look at the running back position for them, and you have Christian McCaffrey and Zach Moss. So the RB2 spot could be a little bit of an issue. And not that we'd be trading them a running back per se, but you're going to be looking at every spot on your roster that you can upgrade, right? They have a Travis Kelce. This is a team that is definitely built to win this year, which does not mean that they're going to throw picks and value away just to win this season. You don't know that they're going to do that. It's very much overly simplistic to assume that they're in for this year, maybe next year, and then, they're embarking upon a rebuild, something to that effect. There are going to be other paths that they can potentially take. They might even be considering moving, one of these guys to try and get a little bit younger. But if there were the case that they do go ahead and try and make some moves to be all in on 2023, one of the things they're going to be thinking when they look at us is, okay, these guys already have lost Justin Jefferson. Maybe they're going to tank if they move DeAndre Hopkins, or I can just definitely push them down. And so that part of it makes the deal more valuable to me. Some managers won't ever look at that, won't even necessarily notice, but some of the ones who are in first place in their leagues are going to have that as something that they are very tuned into. The other element of it then is that they're thinking, if I make this move, it increases my chances to win the whole thing where I have the 112. It certainly starts to lock me in more to the 110 through the 112. And we talked about some of the picks that we've hit on in that, 201 to 2089 range, for example. But everybody has memories of picks that they made in the 108 to the 112 that didn't pan out. And so the manager is going to be thinking the risk of making a pick at 110 or 111 and having it be worth nothing is easily worth increasing my chances to win this year. So you're going to have some managers who make that calculation, and it may be the right calculation. I'm not necessarily criticizing that. We're just thinking through the different ways there are to look at dynasty trades. And so if they're looking at it that way, they might accept a DeAndre Hopkins for a first round pick, even though, obviously DeAndre Hopkins, number one, he's in Tennessee. Number two, he's an older player. And so you might think
number
that's just...
three, he's not worth a first round pick. In that situation, though, people will pay. I understand what you're saying. I'm just saying from my perspective, and that's where you're talking about if the piece or if what you're getting back is valuable. And obviously that would usually be more than we think that is worth.
Well, but again, you've got a name with DeAndre Hopkins. You've got all of this banked production. So, we talk about the middle third of the season. If he has a couple of big games in that middle third, then with all of the production and the name and all of that, if the Tennessee Titans offense doesn't look as tragic as it's looked to this point, then suddenly I don't think it's hard to give a 112 valuation to DeAndre Hopkins at all. And so from that point, I think it becomes interesting. So those are some of the things you're wanting to think about and work through as you try and decide, is it time to buy? Is it time to sell? And counterintuitively, it can be on a bad team that you actually decide to buy. It can be on a good team that you decide to sell. It's not as simple as just kind of going through the motions and jettisoning players when your team is bad and buying them when you're searching for either the number one seed or you're searching for the number 6 seed. We kind of think about the real buy situations as being A, try and lock in the buy, or B, try and qualify for the playoffs at all, right? Those are the two real buy leverage points where you've got to make that move across a certain threshold. Be willing to think about all of the other nuance that is involved in building the best team for the long term that's going to get you the most buys over the next decade.
Awesome stuff. Awesome stuff. Hopefully people who have listened in have enjoyed some of the strategy conversation. Hopefully your teams are in a position that they're heading towards the championship and they're in that perpetual championship window, but it may be a case that you are planning ahead to next season. Hopefully the information we've discussed today will be beneficial. If there is anything that we didn't discuss today you think would be beneficial from a dynasty or a redraft perspective, do let us know. You can let me know on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. You can also follow me there, or you can email across at rotovizradio@gmail.com. We'll try and fit some of those topics in on future shows. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.